Good morning. It is March 15th, Friday morning, and it's time for part two in My Culture War with nationalism and a surprise that I may vote for as the focus. I appreciate the hate that my fellow citizens are allowed to have for the United States, are allowed to express. It's the extensive freedom of speech, the enshrined freedom of speech, and the culture of complaining to make things better, to have some control, ability for citizens to have some control at the local, at the state, and at the federal level to influence in many ways how our government runs. As I continue to understand the rest of the world, as through various means, through my family connections, through my work, through just experiencing the world through the internet, as limited as it is, I understand in the past and in the present, and expectations of the future, how lucky we are to have the freedom to hate our own country and to express it and try to make it better. I think this anger at our nation is magnified by social media, and it creates a kind of feeling, a kind of negative feeling towards the United States overall. It's pervasive in Hollywood. It's magnified through movies out to the world, and we're at the top of the heap, top of the mountain, and the wolves circle around, and we're the alpha, and there's all these claws trying to knock the king off the mountain. All that's understandable. I keep that in mind when I say I am, even just to say the words, I am a nationalist. It's scary. I'm looking around like I'm not that kind of. I just respect and appreciate my nation, and I even respect and appreciate other nations and their identity. It seems crazy from the perspective of being in another nation, imagining myself, or when I am in another nation, and hearing how much the people there appreciate their own identity, their own as a country, with their particular not laws, and they can be very homogeneous, so it can be culture and laws mixed together, but just the borders, geographic borders, there's reasons why they're divided out. I'm especially familiar with Japan because of my family, but I see it in China, especially similar country to the United States in size and much more in population, but in various European nations and around the world. It's I think it has value where there's billions of us, and dividing us up regionally, dividing us up and having multiple identities helps that tribal need. And tribalism is a social tool that in excess is a huge problem. So there's balance between community and individual, between tribalism and more of a globalism, or nationalism and globalism. Like there's balances and there's values, keeping it all in mind to have progress that is as with the least amount of destruction and suffering. That's my ultimate. Whatever helps humanity progress with the least amount of destruction and suffering to the environment, to suffering to people, just in general. Whatever political party, whatever political beliefs, and I see freedom to complain, freedom to hate within our nation as um, being great for that. I am a nationalist. I love the United States. I'm 42 years old, and I haven't always felt this way, but especially in the last 10 years, I've come to acknowledge the strengths that other countries just don't have, the kind of enshrined rights and protections that even places like Great Britain don't have, or Canada doesn't have. So, and things that are easy to criticize, I kind of appreciate, like the electoral college. People love to hate on the United States' election system, in particular the electoral college, where not everybody's vote has the same weight in some ways, or in a lot of ways. If you are in a less populous state, your individual vote has more weight federally. That makes sense to me. It makes sense because you're comparing a dense urban area. Like there's a balance. The Senate and the House of Representatives, two senators per state, and then a number of representatives that's associated with the population. Like there's a balance. These two legislative houses balancing just a purely population expression, and then that there's some independence with the state. There's a state identity. The United States, we're vast, and one part is very different than another part. If you live in the city all your life, or you live on one coast with one, even the climate can be completely different. Your experience can be completely different in one place compared to another, and the population can be vastly different. So I think it makes sense that in some ways where the population is sparse and spread out, they're able to express themselves politically and be heard. Not, and it's a balance, it's not just the Senate that is the legislative body where two states of vastly different population are equal. No, there's also the House of Representatives. And those two combined are how many electoral votes they have. So California, with a much larger population, has many more electoral votes than a state with a smaller population. Even though it's not an individual vote in California has less weight than an individual vote than, say, Wyoming. Wyoming still has some significance. An individual vote in Wyoming, because the population is so much different, even though there's an exaggerated significance, because they have two senators, and I believe the minimum is two House representative congressmen. So they're, I guess, 4 is the minimum number. And then California has so many more. I forget how many. They're not ignored. If it was purely based off of population, Wyoming would just be this afterthought. And even inside of Oregon, in talking to my mom, who lives in Southern Oregon, when I live in Portland, the politics within the state are very focused around Portland. What's good for Portland, and kind of ignoring the rest of the state. There's a little sense of that. So it's also some balance internally with a state Senate and a state House. It makes sense. Electoral college makes sense. So when I look at the European Union and I look at Brexit, and I think, well, why did Brexit happen ultimately? Was the voice of British people being ignored, or did they not feel represented? Were they being subsumed into this European Union? And I think so. I think that is ultimately why people voted to leave the European Union, is they did not feel properly represented. And I think that's fair. It makes sense to me. It may not ultimately be good for them as a people and for them as a nation. It may. I think it will. I think it's a good lesson that if you're going to push for something like the European Union, you need to make sure that people are and feel represented. And I think something like the Electoral College has worked for the United States. And I could see it being adjusted, but I wouldn't want it to go away. I I've been struggling with who I would support, who I will support for president. Now, the last election, a few years ago, I was looking at Bernie Sanders. As a Green Party person, I switched to the Democrat to register as a Democrat so I could vote for Bernie Sanders. And I mean, a lot of people didn't appreciate that. They felt that I was being disloyal to the Green Party, but I felt Bernie Sanders at the time was a unique opportunity. Over the past few years, I've been disappointed with Bernie Sanders. There's a number of things that he said, that he's done. I've seen him as, and plus he's getting older, and I think that means something. Someone as old as him taking on the office of president, I think, given his apparent health, would be too much. I don't think he would be operating at the level that he needs to. But when he surrendered the stage, there was a protest where he was speaking, and he surrendered to a few protesters, gave up his mic. That came across as weak to me. That was not the leader that I wanted. Later, he said some things that were not true, and I believe that he knew that they weren't true, and he said them, I think, just to cultivate the populist vote. And I think it was done in error. I liked Bernie Sanders, even though I didn't agree with some of the things, with maybe even many of the things that he was advocating for. I liked him because I thought he was sincere, that he was being forthright and honest. And when he backed away from that, when he bowed his head, when he caved in, he lost my respect and he lost my support. So that brings in the surprise. Andrew Yang, who I first heard on a Joe Rogan podcast, and then I thought about him, and what he's advocating for, I'm not sure. My instincts are I don't agree with him on many of his solutions, but what he's talking about, what he's bringing to the table to converse about, technology. And where I live is Green Party meets Pirate Party, environmentalism and technology. That is where I like to have a conversation. That is where I like to be politically. I don't really have a home there. There isn't really a home that exists there, but Andrew Yang is pretty close. He's talking about what is going to happen to all those drivers, all those truck drivers, when their jobs are automated away. What is the landscape, the job landscape, going to look like? What is the environmental landscape going to look like? How is technology going to affect? I think so many people in the political field are maybe personally ignorant, but allowing the ignorance of the populace to drive their conversation. And Andrew Yang, I see as pushing the reality onto the population, future thinking. And things are changing so fast. I think the average American citizen doesn't understand how much the world has changed, even in the last 10 years outside the United States. It's vastly different. Just thinking of China alone, how big of the Green New Deal is a big thing right now, right? China as a polluter, they're so terrible, and there's no sign of them slowing down, and they're exporting their most terribly polluting industries into Vietnam, into northern Vietnam. They're doing some truly awful things, and they're cloaking it, and it's not common knowledge, and yeah, I think Andrew Yang has the best conversations, and I want to see him on the stage, and I want the debates to focus on what he is talking about, even if I don't necessarily agree with where he ends up. I think he has that sincerity, and drive that I saw in Bernie Sanders, but I think Andrew Yang is even better and even more on point with what he's talking about, and I hope that everyone and anyone listening to this takes a look at him and considers what he has to offer. See you next week for part 3 in My Culture War.